of the weirdest anomalies in international cricket across cricket history has been the way that England has understood, interacted with, behaved towards, and critically analysed one-day international cricket. While most of the other major teams follow a certain pattern that could be reasonably organised and understood and placed into a plotted chart, England has always been a unique specimen in this case. The differences between the way that England behaves towards one-day international cricket is significantly different than the way that Pakistan or New Zealand or the West Indies historically have. So if there is ever a situation that is worth studying, it would be specifically what England understands and thinks about one-day cricket in contradistinction to everyone else. And that's where the interesting analysis can come out of. So, for example, there's the question of how many one-day internationals should you play in a domestic summer. Australia obviously led the way after World Series cricket ended, and you saw the creation of the World Series tournament, which existed from the early 80s right to the late 2000s. It involved playing at minimum 8 one-day internationals over the summer, and as many as 11. And so Australia led the way in this regard in terms of how many one-day games should be played over a summer, and many of the other teams have followed suit. So generally, it's somewhere between 5 and 10 is the typical number of how many one-day games should be played in a domestic summer. Then, when you count the various tours that teams go on over the course of the rest of the summer and then to England over the winter, it means that it usually adds up that you will end up playing between 20 and 30 one-day internationals each year. And that has been particularly the standard that is considered the norm for the longest time. And that's why when you look at the number of one-day internationals that most of the major teams have played and the records that they've achieved, generally they are comparable. The number of one-day games that Inzamam ul Haq has played versus Ricky Ponting versus Stephen Fleming versus Rahul Dravid are all reasonably comparable. But England never followed suit. They were the anomaly. They had this rule that only a couple of one-day internationals would be played each of their summers. Sometimes it would be just a single game on its own, but normally it would be a series of 3 matches, and they would usually be used as just a prelude to the most important test series that summer. And so there was never a situation where the one-day tournament was of any significant meaning or importance. It was usually just a new set of tour matches before the big test series happened. And so throughout the 1980s and 1990s, spanning a full 20-year period, each summer of English cricket involved, at most, they might play 3 one-day internationals versus the major test team touring, and then they might play another one against the minor touring team. So at most, they could be playing 4, but generally only 3, and sometimes even less than that. And so it's the case that over the course of a long period of time, as you chart it out, England just end up playing fewer and fewer one-day internationals than their immediate rivals. And that of course has significant consequences for the development of the team. It's obviously the case that as you have and you build up a certain culture and sophisticated understanding of the game, that you're going to be in a much superior position than you would otherwise if you play fewer games. And so England were essentially selling themselves short and setting up for their own failure by laying down such weak and unstable and brittle foundations for the longest period of time. all came to a head in the 1999 World Cup, where England failed to qualify for the Super Sixes. And that seems to have been the trigger point for a renewal and a new approach to how England should have one-day internationals. And so it was decided at that moment that England needed to borrow some ideas from the Australian model, which is when they decided to create the Tri-Series. And so from 2000 to 2005, spanning 6 different seasons, there was a Tri-Series between England and the 2 touring test teams, both the major and the minor ones. And then that continued up until 2006, when they decided to flip it around and change it to a 2 sets of usually 5 one-day internationals against both the minor and major touring teams. Although that has changed sometimes it's a 3-7 model, other times there has been a 5-5-3 model. There's been a rich variety over the course of the last 12 years, but generally it's a 5-5 model. So while we saw in the Tri-Series, it was a typical round-robin system where there were 3 teams and they all played each other 3 times, so they ended up playing 6 games, and then the final would happen at Lord's. And then typically from 2006 onwards, England would play 10 games minus any games that were washed out. So England have been able to learn the lessons of their past and actually figured out that if they're actually going to become a relevant and competent one-day team, they have to play a certain significant amount of one-day internationals each season. And so at long last, after 20 years of failure, they finally got the formula right and have been reaping the rewards ever since, which is why England are one of the best one-day international sides right now, and they are right now one of the favourites to win the 2019 ICC World Cup tournament next year. So after 20 years of preparation and hard work and commitment, it looks as though England have been reaping the rewards for learning the failures of the past. Because England continued to fall behind the rest of the world in terms of how many one-day internationals a team ought to play over the course of a typical calendar year, this has meant that the English one-day international records and statistics have always looked rather odd and don't sit well in comparison with most other teams. So if we go through all the major figures, such as the most capped players, typically if you look at India or Australia or New Zealand or West Indies or any other team, the record is held by someone who has played over 300 games, and then if you go down into the top 10, you mostly find people who have played over 200 games. But when you look at England, these records have mostly only been created in the last 20 years since they started playing the proper allotment of 10 one-day internationals per summer through the 5-5 one-day series, or when they played the Tri-Series. So if you were to look at the records before 1999, then the highest achievement in terms of one-day internationals played would have only been about 120. So it was simply the case that because everyone played so few one-day games each year, that even if you played a full career, someone like Alan Lamb or Ian Botham or David Gower, someone who was a regular on the England cricket team for their entire first-class career, they would only barely make it over 100 games. And yet, for most other Test nations in the world, reaching 100 games would be normally something you would achieve after playing for 4 or 5 years. And then, if you look at the highest score for the longest time, right up until very recently, the highest score achieved by an individual batsman for England in one-day international cricket was achieved all the way back in 1999, in comparison to most other teams, in fact all other teams, whose record for the highest individual score in one-day internationals was scored after the turn of the millennium. And so while most other Test nations were scoring lots of big 150 scores, and the record was very high, the only couple of very high England scores stood out quite a significant margin. The fact of the matter is that so few English one-day international hundreds were scored that the couple that really took off and made huge leaps were the ones that held the record for the longest period of time. And you can do the same thing in terms of who has scored the most one-day international runs and who has taken the most one-day international wickets. So if you take who has scored the most one-day international runs for England in one-day international cricket, for a very long time, that was Alex Stuart. Alex Stuart played 170 one-day internationals, having played for England for some 14 years. So 14 years, only 170 games, and scored something like 4,000 runs. Now 4,000 runs in comparison to many other nations whose records might be in the 8,000, the 9,000 or even the 10,000 is a significant drop. And it was only very recently, first of all, Alex Stuart had the record when he retired in 2003, and then it was finally taken over by Paul Collingwood in 2011, and now finally, at long last, Paul Collingwood has been overtaken by someone else. And it's still the case. Paul Collingwood also now has the record for the most one-day internationals played for England, which is 197. And so still, even after at this point, even after many players have reached playing 400 one-day internationals, England has not been able to achieve a single player to have played over 200. And so these are just some of the examples of some of the statistics which England are finally in a position to catch up on after having fallen behind the game so significantly thanks to their decision to not play a large number of one-day internationals from the early 80s right up to the late 90s. One of the difficulties in terms of actually understanding and dealing with this issue is that for a very long time England were able to punch above their weight, which provided them with a false sense of hope and misguided them in terms of their appreciation for just how far they were falling behind. And so while when they looked at actually what was happening on the cricket field, they could be very proud of themselves, they could think that they're doing a good job, they could just make this assumption that everything is going according to plan, and they didn't realize, or they didn't understand, or they didn't notice, or they didn't understand how to detect just how far things were falling apart over the course of time. Let me be clear about this. England, despite having some terrible absences of playing significant numbers of one-day international cricket, have actually been able to make the final of the ICC World Cup frequently. Now, they never won it, they never were actually able to win the World Cup, which obviously is a sign that they've never been the best one-day international side in the world, but at the same time they've been able to reach the final repeatedly, which has provided them, I guess, with a sense that they're not far away from being one of the best. They're just a little bit behind, but you know, with a bit of more hard work they could actually reach it. And so in 1979 they made the final, in 1987 they made the final, and then in 1992 they made the final. And so 3 separate occasions they were competing in the final for that World Cup trophy, and so the fact that they didn't win it is fate of history, but luck could have gone in a different direction and they could have actually won a World Cup, and that would have been quite significant. A team that seems to be mismanaging so badly, that seems to not understand what one-day international cricket is all about, and that seems to be managing themselves into the ground, actually gets to win the tournament. But, you know, for whatever you might call it, irony or luck's sake, or the gods of cricket, England lost all 3 of those finals. Eventually, reality would come to reassert itself, and that came particularly after the mid-90s. At that point, all of the other Test nations had worked so hard in terms of playing lots of one-day international cricket, understanding how that game is played, and actually getting a deeper and more richer and more meaningful and more powerful sense of how that sport is actually played, that they were able to ascend to the next level and were able to leave England behind. And so in 99, 96, 2003, 2007, 2011 and 2015. Every single World Cup after the 1992 World Cup, where they made it into the finals, England have proven themselves to be completely inadequate for actually just competing for a spot in the final, let alone thinking that they could win this tournament. They have either been eliminated from the first round of the tournament and failed to go on to the next round, or they were eliminated within that second round. So in 1999 they failed to make it to the Super Sixes. In 2003 they failed to make it to the Super Sixes. In 96 they were knocked out in the quarterfinals. In 2007 they made it into the Super 8s but could not make it into the semi-finals. And then in 2011 and 2015 they were eliminated also very early on. And so not only have they been not winning tournaments, not even making into the finals, not making into the semi-finals, and definitely not putting themselves in contention to win these tournaments, not only that, but in terms of just putting up really solid, high-quality performances, they have always been falling behind. And it seems as though so many times, on so many occasions, they just don't seem to have the know-how, the understanding, the brains, the strategies, that they can actually present themselves competently and seriously in a one-day international environment. And it's been the case repeatedly that they have been humiliated simply through not being able to understand how the game ought to be played and how they're actually meant to be competing. And they've just looked completely out of their depth, out of sorts, and without a clear understanding of what they're trying to do. And so it has taken a very long time for them to actually figure out that they need to be paying greater attention to how one-day international cricket trends follow, how one-day cricket is played. They can't just follow strict formulas or rely on tradition or focus too much on particular get-rich schemes, that they actually have to play lots of one-day international cricket, play it at a very high quality, make sure that they've got the best teams playing, make sure that they get a very good set of backup players in case of injuries, and make sure that they're always believing that they have the right and duty to compete with the best teams in one-day international cricket. It has taken such a long time to get this right, and often there have been huge setbacks. The setbacks they suffered in 2011 were absolutely shocking, but then again, the setbacks they suffered in 2007 were shocking. And then what we saw in 2015, we saw signs here and there of them doing it right and getting it there, and they seemed to be doing some things right, but then on other aspects of it, they were doing it all wrong, and they seemed to be just cutting off their own leg and falling behind. And so, with each step that England has moved forward, they've taken 2 steps back for the longest time. And I can only say that in the last 3 or so years have we begun to see a one-day international side of England that actually seems to have the capacity, the manpower, the resources, the confidence, the sheer strength and muscle and determination that actually means that they could be serious competitors for this 2019 World Cup happening next year. So, one example of get-rich-quick schemes, or you might call it formulaic forms of cricket management, is the idea of the nerdler. So, England managers would have noticed that some of the best one-day international cricket teams have players who aren't necessarily great stroke makers or sloggers, but are very crafty and clever batsmen who are able to knock the ball into gaps, run quick ones, get twos by running quickly, hitting the ball into the gaps like over players' heads and making sure to drop the ball down in the outfield. And they're very clever in terms of how they try to manipulate the field in order to take the advantage of scoring as many runs as possible, even when they're not necessarily able to score regular boundaries. And so that's not wrong. That analysis is not incorrect. It is true that these players do exist, and it is true that a successful team should have these sorts of players. But it is simply not the case that these sorts of players exist in some sort of very narrowly minded skill set, as though they've been trained to do this job and this job alone. They understand no other job, and if they were assigned a different job, they would be completely incompetent of it. The process is much more natural and organic and disorganized and functionalist rather than utilitarian. It's about getting the job done the best way possible rather than following a very strict formula. But the England managers of cricket don't seem to have appreciated this fact, and so they have for a long time looked towards having certain players in their team that they think will play the nerdler role, and then thought that if they put them in the middle order and tell them just knock it through the gaps and hit ones here and there, that that will suffice in terms of actually according that role in the team. And what ends up happening instead is that the player will just simply not be able to function properly because they can't properly play cricket, because cricket, when you're on the field, is obviously about looking at a situation and responding to it in a professional and serious and most coherent sense, and if you've only been able to do one thing, then you will end up being incapable of responding to a specific concrete situation. The other case is that a player actually is very good, very talented, and can achieve all sorts of roles, and so they will evolve beyond the limitations of the roles they were assigned. And so it ends up that you don't end up having this sort of player that you thought you would have. and that just could confuse the managers and make them wonder whether they chose the right player. And so whichever player we happen to be talking about in terms of being this professional nerdler, maybe we're talking about Graham Thorpe or Paul Collingwood, whoever it may be, they don't follow this formula. They aren't strictly adhering to the guidelines that they've been assigned, and often the English cricket managers don't have the understanding of how cricket ought to be played that they can actually respond in the most appropriate way, and so they end up making foolish mistakes. Another problem that England have tended to have with their one-day international cricket sides is having a captain as an opening batsman who tends to bat quite slowly and tries to score runs alongside a more aggressive, hard-hitting opener. Now, often this can be a very good idea, and it can be a very good cricket strategy, and I certainly wouldn't say that it's the wrong thing to do, but in order to impose a strict formula on this is rather dangerous. And so let me just give you an example. You could argue that Mark Taylor was a similar such position, because he was the captain, he was an opening batsman, he tended to bat much slower than his partners, and he tended to be more reliable. He tended to score a lot of half-centuries that were good and solid and stocky and get the job done, while more aggressive and flashy scoring could be scored at the other end. But at a certain point of time, that type of cricket in a narrow sense becomes unviable, and you need to adapt to a more flexible and broader sense, which is where someone like Mark Waugh comes into play, because Mark Waugh had the flexibility and the capacity and the skill set to be both an aggressive opener and a conservative opener, to actually play flashy and play shots, but also to hold it together. And so he seemed to be a much more well-rounded person. Mark Waugh was a far superior one-day international cricketer than Mark Taylor ever was. The problem for England has always been the case that they have seen the idea of having a defensive opening batsman in a more conservative formulaic sense, as though the biggest thing they're worried about is becoming overwhelmed by the bowling, getting bowled out, and not being able to occupy the crease for enough time to actually take advantage of the 50 overs you're given. And so you get a batsman who is more upright, more technically correct, who enjoys occupying the crease, who won't throw his wicket away through dumb shots, who's very calculating in what shots to play to make sure that the crease is occupied and you take up those 50 overs as best you can. And so they're not looking for a more defensive opener in the hopes of finding someone who could also flip it around and be more dynamic if the case required, but in a very narrow sense, in the narrow sense of having a particular role that needs to be filled and finding a player who can most fill it. So Michael Atherton, Michael Vaughan, Andrew Strauss, Alastair Cook, Ian Bell all follow that same pattern. Very conservative, upright, don't take too many risks, and always are there to occupy as much of the crease as possible. England have never actually gone out of their way to find a Marcus Trescothic type player, someone who is very aggressive, who likes to score quickly, who can also stick around for long enough to actually score hundreds and ends up scoring quite a lot of hundreds over the course of his career. They have not tried to find and recruit and train up lots of Marcus Trescothics, and instead look to be much more conservative and formulaic and strict in the way that they approach cricket management. And so that's why, since Marcus Trescothic left the English cricket team, for the longest time they did not have anyone who could fill up that role, and it was not until some high quality players of Jason Roy and Alex Hale showed up that they were actually finally able to fill those positions with those sorts of players. This brings me to the Adam Gilchrist syndrome. From the time when Adam Gilchrist showed up and was a superstar as a wicketkeeper who opened the batting, who batted very aggressively, and who ended up scoring lots of quick hundreds, all across the world there have been attempts at teams finding their own Adam Gilchrist, and it's become a rather sick fascination. Now, sometimes these teams were able to find players who were very good and deserved to be opening the batting, or deserved to be put batting in the middle order. They were that good at batting that they actually could fit into the middle order. And I'm thinking of Kamran Akmal or Brendan McCullum. These were high quality players who were mostly batsmen who could also wicketkeep, and so if you wanted a wicketkeeper and opening batsman, those were your goes. But for far too often, it has been the case that the Adam Gilchrist syndrome has sent players in the wrong direction, and they've actually put players into the opening wicketkeeper, aggressive opening batsman position who should not have been there. And so the Adam Gilchrist syndrome has affected plenty of teams over the years and sent so many teams to do so many silly things at various times, but one of them has definitely been England. And that is particularly, there was a series of players that were selected for England to be one-day international wicketkeepers, and were selected particularly because they could open the batting or bat up in the upper order, expecting them to do the Adam Gilchrist role, but they didn't. They were not capable of it, they didn't have the skills to do it, and it was a miserable failure. And it has only just been in the last 3 or 4 years, with the arrival of Jos Butler and Johnny Bairstow, who are very good, aggressive, attacking wicketkeeper batsmen, but who neither of whom deserve to be opening, and shouldn't be opening, but rather should be batting in the middle order. At long last, it seems that England have gotten over this syndrome of Adam Gilchrist and actually are making their wicketkeeper batsmen bat in positions that they ought to be. And so it was a syndrome that England suffered through, although it is the case that many others suffered through it as well. And so England certainly aren't the sole sinners in this case, but what they did to Geraint Jones especially was very poor form. They decided that Geraint Jones should be a wicket-keeping, aggressive opening batsman, even though he had never shown a particular talent for that, and they forced it upon him, and it didn't come off, and they were not happy with the experiment, and then he was dropped shortly after, and the way he was treated was very poor. And just finally, something needs to be said about Jimmy Anderson and Stuart Broad. Both of them, for about 10 years, from 2006 to 2015, were the regular opening bowlers for England in both Test cricket and one-day international cricket. But then England did very poorly in the 2015 World Cup, and the English administration decided that it was time for a renewal. It's time to kick out the old players and bring in some new ones, to actually refresh the team and let it go in a new direction. And a whole bunch of players who were playing in that 2015 World Cup were never selected again, and their careers were ended because it was deemed it was time to move on and go in a different direction. And so even if they were very great players, even if they had a couple of more years in them, it was decided that that was the time to go. James Anderson never played another one-day international after the 2015 World Cup, and Stuart Broad, nearly the same case, except he was brought in to play one-day international during the English tour of South Africa. So other than that one game, this happened to Stuart Broad as well. Now, I'm all in favour of players being moved on when the time is right, and certainly England needed to go in a new direction for one-day international cricket, and it was not right for them to just stick around with Stuart Broad and James Anderson forever. So I understand that part, but to just simply force this decision upon these players, even though they might have lasted for 6 months or 12 months more, then the decision seemed to be just too hasty. You might have gotten some advantage over having these two players around for a bit longer and holding on to them and keeping them in the one-day squad and actually taking advantage of their experience and resources and skills and trying to find a way to build up a big new generation of English fast bowlers through taking advantage of having these senior players for a little bit longer, maybe 6 months or 12 months, a bit longer. And that seems to be a common trend throughout the history of English one-day international cricket, that after you fail to win a World Cup, after you do very poorly in a World Cup, you just decide it's time for a massive cull, and you just axe a whole bunch of people who were deemed to be too old to continue on to the next World Cup, and it's time to just pick a fresh squad and actually start again and move on with things. And you decide not to keep these players around for maybe 6 or 12 more months just to see what else you can get out of them and what type of developments and new ideas you can get out of them. Just decide, okay, we're going to cut them out now and that's the end of them forever, and we're not going to be allowing them to play any more role in English one-day international cricket going forward. That is a very reckless and hasty mindset and way to go about it, and it is very dangerous because all that experience, all that skill set, all those resources that James Anderson and Stuart Broad and then other players from past examples of this happening are just wasted. And that is, of course, a great tragic history of English one-day international cricket. Wasting opportunities, wasting talent, wasting resources, and going off on really bad misadventures. So it's not surprising that English one-day international cricket has been filled with more failures than wins, has been filled with many stupid distractions, stupid chasing down rabbits, trying to find some magical formula, trying to find a get-rich-quick scheme, trying to just find the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. Too many times they have wasted their resources and manpower and ideas and money on stupid distractions rather than doing the gritty, hard work that's based on realistic assessment, that's based on honest accountability, that's based on trying to build up a high-quality, skilled one-day international team. And so if ever there was something to say about English one-day international cricket, it's that they are pathetic managers and that they continually waste their resources and have gotten a real bad reputation. And it's only been in the last 3 years, that they have finally been able to overcome that bad reputation and are looking towards trying to accomplish something greater, something grander, and being a competent one-day international side going into the future. And so that is a sorry, tragic history for one-day international cricket in England, and we just have to hope that in this 2019 World Cup they are actually going to be competitive and actually going to try to win this tournament, because it would would be really nice to see England compete in the One Day International Tournament final at Lord's in late June, and they actually try to win this tournament, because they deserve something, because they've done a lot of great work over these last 3 years. They have moved moved mountains over the last 3 years. They've advanced very far, and it would be nice to see if they could get rewarded for it. So that's all I have to say about that for now. So until then, goodbye.